Buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most intense and consequential dramas unfolding on the world stage. Welcome to the Ukraine conflict, a masterclass in failed diplomacy. Picture this: a nation trapped in a brutal clash between East and West, its borders shattered, its people suffering under the weight of war. How did we arrive at this point? Could it have been stopped? Stay tuned as we unravel the high-stakes game that spiraled out of control, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This isn't just a story about tanks, missiles, or shattered cities, though it is tragically that too. This is a story about diplomacy, or rather the stunning failure of diplomacy, where miscalculations, broken promises, and missed opportunities led the world to the brink. From the halls of the Kremlin to the corridors of NATO, from the Ukrainian streets to the United Nations chambers, this is a story where every word, every gesture, and every silence carried the weight of history. So buckle up as we unravel how diplomacy failed and the world paid the price. To understand the Ukraine conflict, we need to trace its roots back not just years, but decades. Ukraine, a nation strategically perched between Russia and Europe, has always been at the crossroads of power struggles. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine found itself an independent nation, but one deeply divided. The west of Ukraine leaned towards Europe, embracing democratic reforms and economic ties with the European Union. The east, on the other hand, had strong historical, cultural, and economic ties to Russia. This division was more than just geographic. It was ideological, cultural, and deeply personal for millions of Ukrainians. For years, Ukraine balanced these two worlds, but this delicate equilibrium was shattered in 2014. The trigger? The Euromaidan protests. What began as a peaceful protest against President Viktor Yanukovych's decision to reject an EU trade deal in favor of closer ties with Russia soon escalated into a nationwide movement. The streets of Kyiv became battlegrounds as protesters clashed with security forces. The world watched as Ukraine teetered on the edge of revolution. When Yanukovych fled to Russia in February 2014, the stage was set for a confrontation that would engulf the entire region. For Russia, this wasn't just about Ukraine's internal politics. It was about influence, power, and the fear of losing a crucial buffer state to the West. When pro-Russian forces seized Crimea and held a widely criticized referendum, which led to its annexation by Russia, it marked the first time since World War II that European borders were changed by force. This bold move sent shockwaves across the globe, but it was just the beginning. In eastern Ukraine, pro-Russian separatists declared independence, sparking a conflict that would soon draw in both Russian and Western forces, albeit in different capacities. Now let's talk about the diplomacy, or lack thereof, that followed. The annexation of Crimea was a wake-up call, but instead of responding with a united, effective diplomatic effort, the international community fumbled. Sanctions were imposed on Russia, but they were piecemeal and not universally enforced. There were endless rounds of talks, from the Geneva negotiations to the Minsk agreements, but these efforts were often reactive, short-term, and ultimately ineffective. The Minsk agreements, signed in 2014 and 2015, were meant to de-escalate the situation in eastern Ukraine. On paper, they promised a ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, and political dialogue. In reality, they were a band-aid on a gaping wound. The ceasefires were repeatedly broken, and the political dialogue never truly took off. Why? Because both sides viewed the agreements not as a path to peace, but as a way to buy time and consolidate their positions. For Ukraine, the Minsk agreements were seen as a bitter pill, a compromise forced upon them by the harsh reality of military losses and international pressure. For Russia, they were a means to keep Ukraine destabilized and within its sphere of influence. The West, particularly Europe, was caught in a bind. On one hand, there was a strong desire to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia. On the other, there was a recognition that Russia's actions couldn't go unpunished. The result was a half-hearted approach: sanctions that hurt but didn't cripple, diplomatic efforts that aimed for compromise but lacked the teeth to enforce it. Meanwhile, the United States oscillated between supporting Ukraine with military aid and trying to engage Russia in dialogue, but without a clear, consistent strategy. This diplomatic limbo continued for years, with neither side willing to fully commit to a path of peace or war. The conflict in eastern Ukraine became a frozen conflict, with periodic flare-ups but no resolution in sight. And while the world's attention occasionally shifted away, the human cost continued to mount. Over 13,000 dead, millions displaced, and entire regions left in ruins. So where does that leave us today? The Ukraine conflict stands as a stark reminder of what happens when diplomacy fails. It's not just about missed opportunities or failed negotiations. It's about the real human cost of those failures. The conflict in Ukraine has reshaped the geopolitical landscape, deepening the divide between Russia and the West, and setting a dangerous precedent for how international disputes can be handled or mishandled in the future. For Ukraine, the consequences have been devastating. The annexation of Crimea and the ongoing conflict in the Donbas region have left the country fractured and struggling to maintain its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The Ukrainian people, who once looked to the West with hope, now face an uncertain future, caught between the aspirations of European integration and the harsh realities of Russian aggression. For Russia, the conflict has solidified its role as a pariah in the eyes of much of the international community, but it has also demonstrated Moscow's willingness to assert its influence through force, regardless of international law. The West, meanwhile, has been forced to confront its own limitations in dealing with an aggressive, revisionist power like Russia. The sanctions, though painful, have not deterred Russia from its course, and the diplomatic efforts have not brought peace to Ukraine. And let's not forget the wider implications. The Ukraine conflict has strained the global order, contributing to a new era of great power competition. It has shown the world that the post-Cold War consensus is fragile, and that peace in Europe can never be taken for granted. It's a cautionary tale of how quickly regional conflicts can escalate, and how the failure to address them effectively can have far-reaching consequences. Thank you for taking the time to join me in unpacking the Ukraine conflict, a tragic yet crucial example of failed diplomacy in our modern world. If you found this exploration insightful, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with those who seek to understand the complexities of our world, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories that shape our lives. And here's a question for you. What do you think could have been done differently to avoid the escalation of the Ukraine conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, let's keep learning from the past to better navigate the future.